First, can we lay out some groundwork? I'm going to ask you a big question here, and I know it's probably asking too much, but could you give us a brief definition of symbol and throw in any nuances or caveats that you want? I just want to kind of set the stage of what we're doing here today.
Yeah. Well, as we know, philosophy deals always with the presupposed, things that we already know but don't advert to, things that are present cognitively, implicitly, tacitly in our horizon of knowledge, but which we don't pay attention to until a philosopher comes around and asks the right question. And these prime questions, these initial primordial matters, sometimes called primitive concepts. They use that even in the sciences. Every science has its primitive concepts. In geometry, the point, the line, and the surface, for instance, they don't ask, do points exist or do lines exist? They presume that they're there. They say, once we have those, what can we do with them on a plane or in a three-dimensional space? That's true in all the sciences, even the social sciences. It's just that philosophy steps back even further and gets questions that all of these other sciences also presuppose but don't explicitly discuss, like being, the one, the true, the beautiful, the good. And the question here is for anybody interested in semiotics, and particularly in the approach we find in Jean Poinsot, Charles Sanders Peirce, and later on the late John Deely, is whether sign is one of those primitive concepts. And of signs, symbol is a type, although sometimes confused with sign. It still has usually a characteristic of its own, which we're going to discuss here. But I've noticed in listening to many talks about semiotics and reading books, and particularly reading in Peirce and Poinsot, and in Deely as well, that there are certain things presupposed even by sign. Not only relation, which is brought out ever since the Colnimbrecenses and Poinsot pointed out that we can't really deal with sign unless we understand what we mean by relation. But even relation is something which presupposes certain things. So I'd like to start out by saying symbol is not really a primitive concept. It's an important initial concept. It passes through all sorts of areas, as does sign, but it presupposes, for instance, when you say, well, we have relation is a more primitive concept than sign. But what about the things related? Relation already presupposes that there is some thing or some dimensions in the plural. It presupposes some kind of plurality for there to be relations. And there's a vast possibility there of the kinds of plurality that are spoken of. So it presupposes the idea of unity and multiplicity, which are primitive notions. You can't really get behind those. And I just wanted to say that to begin with, because often I notice confusions regarding semiotics, and it seems to be when you get out of the little area of philosophical semiotics with John Deely and Charles Sanders Peirce and Poinsot, and enter into semiotics as a major area, there is so much confusion, and interdisciplinarity seems to have been replaced by the destruction of disciplines. The disciplines seem to be falling flat on the ground, and was talking about anything and everything in the name of signs. So I think it's important to say that at the beginning, that sign presupposes relation, but relation presupposes something even more basic, which is being and beings, which can be in various ways related. I say that because I'll be teaching a course in metaphysics this semester, and I'm going to try to clarify some of these questions. The metaphysics of our knowledge is the most presupposed and the most powerful cognitively precognitions or of our presuppositions. And I notice when that's first just a content observation about sign and symbol. I haven't distinguished between the two yet. Just to remember, we're not talking about absolutely primitive concepts. It doesn't mean we can't talk about them and apply them very broadly. Let's remember that. Secondly, there is in every great philosopher, particularly in most of them, I would say, what I would like to call an idiosyncratic threshold, not idioscopic, idiosyncratic, a threshold. That is, there's what's so wonderful about the work of John Deely, I think, is because he has been able to bring voices as disparate as Aristotle and Augustine and Thomas and Scotus and Poinsot and Peirce into dialogue, and Heidegger. They're all invited to the table, and they bounce off of each other, and they limit each other, and they also correct each other. And that's what the Great Books Program founder, Robert Maynard Hutchins, back in the middle of the 20th century, founder of the Great Books Program, one of the founders with Mortimer Adler, who had a brief, somewhat troubled collaboration with Deely. Hutchins termed this the great conversation that begins even with Homer and continues to this day. Certain ideas, certain themes, certain approaches that are always interacting in what Peirce calls the community of inquiry, But he himself had somewhat a bit of a difficulty entering into this community of inquiry because he was such a troublesome person and never really collaborated in a philosophy department. He was always writing on his own. And so he and Poinsot and even Deely, and you can say this about, you can ask about most of the philosophers. I would argue that Aristotle perhaps is Plato and Aristotle are perhaps the philosophers who rarely entered close to this idiosyncratic threshold. What I mean by idiosyncratic is at a certain point, they stop conversing with the great tradition and begin developing their own ideas, their own philosophy. And because they're brilliant and because they're fascinating and they already have a bevy of followers, people continue to study them and learn about them. We notice this particularly in Peirce. If you interact with Peirce scholars, Peirce specialists, they vanish inside the world of Charles Sanders Peirce because the guy is so brilliant and his writing is so disparate and so just kind of disorganized. There's always a huge portion of philology that has to play a part in understanding his philosophy, sorting out when he wrote what and what that means in the context of what else he did. It seems to me that what Deely did was identify where that idiosyncratic threshold is in Charles Peirce, in his semiotics and in his three categories, and was able to leave a lot of the rest of it for the Peirce specialists, which is a fine thing to do. Write books about Peirce, talk about Peirce interminably. People do that with Aristotle, do that with Thomas Aquinas, and they don't want to hear about anybody else except Thomas Aquinas. I'm saying that's a shame, and the semiotic movement in philosophy, at least, ought to be alert to where these great thinkers can converse with each other. There's so much in Heidegger, for example, we would not necessarily want to embrace, but he has tremendous contribution, particularly in his notion of Dasein and the ens primum cognitum of Thomas Aquinas, which he doesn't use as a term, but which he obviously is referring to. And so these resonances between great thinkers, where they're talking among themselves, that's what makes philosophy interesting, rather than just the fascination with one particular thinker that you end up lionizing and turning into almost a cult figure. So in semiotics, in the question of what is a sign and then what is a symbol, are they the same? Are they different? How do they differ? There are loads of cosmology, of philosophical anthropology, and of metaphysics presupposed before you can even understand the question, let alone answer it. So we have to be very humble also in dealing with this question of symbol. Nonetheless, we can't presuppose that everybody has taken a complete course in philosophy and is well educated in all these matters. We deal with an audience that is very diversely educated, and in some sense, all of us have our prejudices and our preconceptions. So rhetorically, we're dealing with that kind of an audience. So it is legitimate to ask the question, what is a symbol? Am I being followed up to this point? Is it okay? Okay. So nonetheless, I am going to allow myself to make one aspect of the presupposed, at least for this context, because it's clear that certainly Juan So and Dealey and most of the participants in the Lyceum of Brian Kemple are Christians or sympathetic to Christianity in one form or another, and realize that we're working within a Christian universe when we talk about signs and symbols. And for this, I think there's an extraordinarily helpful insight brought to us by one of the Greek fathers that you don't hear about too much, which to me opens up the distinction between sign and symbol in a most interesting way. That is one of the Cappadocian Fathers. The Cappadocian Fathers were the 4th century trio, Gregory of Nazianzen and St. Basil, his friend, and St. Basil's little brother, a guy named Gregory of Nyssa. The three of them together are known as the Cappadocian Fathers. Why are they important? Not only for theology, but also for philosophy. They are the ones that coined the terminology or classified the terms that we need in order to talk about the difference between nature and person in God and in Christ. Hypostasis or prosopon, persona, on the one hand, and ousia, or physis, nature on the other. This contrast had never been made before in exactly that way. And they draw on Greek philosophy, but they're philosophizing about Christian mysteries. And they generate one of the great ideas that goes forth from the Cappadocian Fathers and is with us today massively. Most people don't realize it has a theological origin, is the very notion of person. And I wish to argue too that person is indeed a primitive concept, that you can't get behind personhood. But this would be a separate talk. But just to continue with Gregory of Nyssa, one thing Gregory of Nyssa said that's extremely interesting. I just read this within the last year. He said, when God created the world, so he didn't just create the beginning of the world and then send it off, like the deists sometimes suggest. God created the world, he put very good principles in it, laws, and it functions very well without his intervention thereafter. This is not only just about God's intervention or not in creation, in a miracle, for example. That's actually a quite different question. The question is, what is creation? And Thomas tells us that creation and preservation or conservation, that is the initial giving of being to a creature, and the maintenance of that being in existence are one and the same act. They're not two different things. He doesn't create and then conserve. And so when God creates the world, this is Gregory of Nyssa, when God created the world, he created the world as we do not yet know it. That is the world that goes all the way to the New Jerusalem. This is why I spent so much time with the Apocalypse, all the way to its consummation. That's what he has in mind. And when he talks about man, now I'm going to create man in my image and likeness. That's the man he creates, the final form, the saint, the perfection, the perfected human being. And we often misunderstand Genesis as talking about the beginning way back then. And now we're thousands of years later, or millions, however you want to count them. It's not really true. The whole is in the picture. So the creation will be perfect. It will have passed through sin, passed through disappointment and suffering and death, but it will be perfected. So everything in the creation is interrelated. We're already hearing the word relation, because it's created by the one God, whose providence passes through every detail, every subatomic particle, every black hole. All of it, in its final form, is perfect, interrelated. So there's nothing in the creation that does not bespeak its creator. Everything says something of God. We recall Thomas Aquinas speaking in I think it's the 8th question in the first part about 3 ways in which God is in his creation. He's in it by power because he upholds it. He's in it by presence because he knows it. Nothing escapes his divine eye. And he's in it by essence, which is the one that makes one almost get pantheistic preoccupations or worries. God's in it, but because absolutely everything reflects some dimension, some possibility within the divine infinitude. It can't be otherwise. And that's the basis, finally, of a whole approach to the creation that we find in a world that prioritizes symbol. That the whole world is symbolic of God. There's nothing you can find. There's no. You could take 100 reais note here and say, what does that have to do with God? Well, this is a note which you can't use this without trusting the person who made it, and also the person who is going to receive this when I buy something at the store. They will trust. They will trust me that there's all this trust going on, which presupposes the existence of truth, and truth finally reduces back to God. I mean, there's nothing that Thomas Aquinas said this. He said, if you want, I could prove everything in philosophy. Just give me anything you want. Give me a pea. Give me a rock. Give me a breeze of wind, and I can use that and take you all the way back to God. That's the ontological, cosmological, creationist, not in a sense of simply the doctrine of creation, basis of a tendency, which can become a temptation, of universalizing and absolutizing symbology or symbolism. But what Gregory of Nyssa says is we must keep that in mind. But what he also did, I mean, he is usually regarded as the most brilliant of the 3 Cappadocian Fathers. He's the most theologically adventurous also. But when he talks about these three levels, the big question back then was, how does the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit relate? How do they relate to each other? Because the tendency in the first centuries was to imagine kind of sloppily some sort of subordination, like the Neoplatonists would do, with the one, then the intellect, and then the soul, then the body, kind of emanation. And Platonism was the best thing going back then, so one tended to sort of imagine the Father, and under him the Son, and under him the Holy Spirit. It's an understandable tendency, and it was occasionally refuted or denied in the early centuries, but it was never thought out until the Cappadocian Fathers came. And resuming it very, 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 very briefly, they concluded that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are co-equal. That is, there is no hierarchy there. There is no hierarchy within the Trinity. There is an origin. The Father is the originator, the generator. The Son is the generated, and the Holy Spirit is the generation of love. Yes, there's a priority, but it's not a priority of hierarchy. It's a priority of simultaneity, of equality. So the hierarchical idea of the universe being, you have God, and you have the angels, and you have man, and you have the material cosmos, that still is valid. But the understanding of God himself is an understanding that does not permit that there is any symbolism within the Trinity. That is, the Son does not symbolize the Father, nor does the Holy Spirit symbolize the Father and the Son. But when Thomas discusses what is then the Son, he gives 3 names for the Son. He says the Son is the Son because he has the same nature as the Father, as any son has the same nature as his Father. He is the Word because he expresses, he utters the reality of the Father fully, completely, without anything left over. He's a complete Word. It's all philosophy, theology, science together. And he's the image. He uses the word image, not the word symbol. Not that these concepts were crystal clear, clearly distinct in antiquity, as I'll mention in a minute. But he chooses the word imago, icon in Greek, because the image, this is an image that is, usually an image is less than what is being imaged. The photo you have of somebody is less than the person themselves, true. But in God, Thomas points out, and in fact, John of St. Thomas even points this out. He doesn't want to use image as one kind of sign for this reason, because of its theological implications. I think perhaps we could correct him on that. It's not. It doesn't have to be a problem, but it does suggest one, because the image, which is the Son, is equal to the imaged, which is the Father, in the notion of image. What this means is, whenever we speak of a hierarchy in one representation evoking on a lower level what is more perfectly possessed on a higher level, that kind of hierarchy, we're not speaking within the Trinity, and we could only be speaking of the creation and its relationship to the Creator. Everything created reflects in some way the divine. That's okay. If we just had the Trinity and the creation, we would have a universal symbology. I'm willing to suggest symbology would be number one. The only place you have image is in the Godhead itself. However, when you open up Genesis, you find out that we were created according to the image of God. We were created according to the image of God, according to image and likeness, secundum imaginem et similitudinem. Augustine says the similitude would be grace, and he adds vestige. He says the creation as such is a vestige, a trace of God, but not an image or a similarity. But man is in the image of God. And so you have a divine anthropology in which human beings are essentially images of God. God is above, and we are below. Why not say we're symbols of God? Well, again, that's not entirely wrong or heretical, because symbol and sign and image are sometimes used alternatively. You need to bring a further distinction into the mix in order to clarify. And that distinction is brought in the doctrine of the Incarnation, because in the Incarnation, also clarified in the 4th century by principles introduced by these three Cappadocian Fathers. The temptation was to say that Christ is in part human and in part divine, kind of half and half, or 75%, 25%, some kind of a mixture. And because of what these guys did, it became clear in the eyes of the church that no, just as there's no hierarchy in the Trinity above, there is no division, there is no mixing, no confusion of divinity and humanity in Christ. They are interpenetrated. You're like, my right hand is in my left hand is in my right hand. They're both of them are equally there. And Christ is fully human and fully divine. And this meant that he, who is the image of God in the Trinity, is now also the norm, or the principle, or the model, or the archetype of the human nature itself, as our human nature is called to this fulfillment in Christo, in Christ. That it's not just a theological faith or belief, but also a deeply metaphysical and anthropological reality, such that Christ says, he who sees me has seen the Father, that he is one as image, as word, as son with the Father, and who becomes an adopted son of Christ participates in this imagetic reality, because we already have the image. What is our image? We are created in the image, and we're taken into the image. What is the image we're created in? our spirituality. That is what spirituality in the sense of we have an intellect and a will. And that's something the animals don't have. They get very close with the estimative sense, but and they have imaginations, they have memories, but they don't have reason or intellect. And so the intellect and the will, its companion, cathectic or appetitive power, those are what make us like the image of God. And Augustine develops this in his anthropology. The memory reflects the Father, the intellect reflects the Son, the will reflects the Holy Spirit in our day-to-day knowledge. It'd be interesting to draw that a little into the semiotic discussion as well, to what extent Augustine's analysis is an enrichment and a help. So what does this mean about symbol and sign and image? It means that the image for the Christian, or for the one who believes in the Trinity and in the Incarnation, I will leave the Eucharist for another time because that takes it even further. But the image has priority over the symbol because of the imagetic nature of mankind and the incarnate image that is Christ. So the visible present church, I mean the visible side of the church in sacrament, in art, in clergy, in papacy, the bishops, the priests, and all of that, the visible side of it, the image of Christ that is carried also in art, and we find this particularly in the very last of the 7 councils, the basic councils, which was in 787, the Second Council of Nicaea, during which the great iconoclastic conflict was resolved, on the part of the church at least. She said, we have to admit images. We can't leave images out. There's a temptation to follow the Jews, and particularly the Muslims, who at the time were saying, look, you create images, you're going to create idolatry. It's going to tear apart the faith. So forbid the images. Just a few weeks ago, I was in the Presbyterian church where I grew up because my father passed away and I was asked to give the eulogy. Once again, I looked around and I said, what did they do to this place? And I realized I hadn't done anything to it because there are no images, no statues. And there's a reason for that. It's a certain resistance that we have to accepting ourselves as images of God and the images that we by nature produce. This art is even the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira in Spain, and they keep finding them all over the place. These primitive human beings were already making images of animals usually, but and the images were often very symbolic as well. But that is our instinct to make art, to create art, is part of our human nature because we already are works of art. Thomas divides his first and second parts of the Summa Theologica according to God and what God produces, and then the second part is man and what man produces. What we produce are above all our moral acts, our virtuous acts and our not so virtuous acts, but it also includes art and technology and science and all the things we produce. So the idea of the image being linked to our human nature and to Jesus Christ as being the norm for our artwork and for the way we imagine the mysteries of the faith. Symbolism is also very important, but it must be subordinated to the image. You can put it this way: symbology is subordinate to iconography in Christianity. You can't say that in Islam. You can't say that in Hinduism. Certainly not in Hinduism, where finally there is no built. There is no primordial image of the Godhead in the Trinity and in our nature. Instead, you just have symbols and symbols and symbols and symbols because it can be done. If you don't have the presence of Christ, if you don't have Christian revelation, if you don't have the Old Testament work of Genesis, finally everything is an emanation of God, and that's true. and everything reflects God as a symbol of his various attributes. That's true. But the personal nature, the personal character in the Trinity and in the Incarnation and in our very nature, that we exist only as persons. There's no such thing as a human nature that isn't a person. You kind of, here's a human nature, let's personify it. No, human nature only exists personally. And this is why Norris Clarke's little book about personhood is so important. And also Richard de Smet's work in Indian philosophy, trying to rescue the idea of person, which falls away or weakens or fades, pales, if it doesn't have the confirmation of these revealed doctrines. So if you opened up a handbook of semiotics like this one by Noot, what's his name, William Noot, Winfried Noot. I'm just going to read just a little part to show where all this background lands us in our day. He says, symbol is one of the most overburdened terms in the field of the humanities. In its broadest sense, symbol is a synonym of sign. That is, you will hear people use it as a synonym. Well, that's a symbol for this or symbol for that. That's ordinary. The common man does not speak philosophical distinctions. You have to work them out. You have to clarify them. So very often symbol and sign will mean the same thing. In spite of the vagueness of terminology, the narrower definitions, which specify symbols as a class of signs, can be grouped into three categories. Now these, I think, are very helpful in the discussion of Peirce's classification. The fact that Peirce doesn't include the formal sign or the concept, and that Poinsot doesn't include the symbol in this more metaphysical sense. But the ones given by Noot are the, let's say, symbol as a conventional sign, largely what Peirce calls the symbol, the conventional sign. Symbol is a kind of iconic sign, and that's also present in Peirce, so we're on the same page with that. But he makes a third one, and symbol as a connotational sign, a connotational sign. For those who don't know Latin philosophical terminology, a denotation is what something indicates directly. If you say, I don't know, a lion is a mammal with a mane, with 4 paws that roars, that's a denotation. If you say he also connotes courage or valor, or the lion on MGM, when an MGM movie begins and this iron appears and roars, you're not interested in its biology, you're interested in what it connotes. And so the symbol is a connotational sign, he says here, which is, I think, is an interesting way of looking at it. It's one that says something, yes, like I was thinking today about the swastika, perhaps the most famous historically and infamous in Indian history. It's one of the most famous and omnipresent signs in Hinduism and Buddhism and in Jainism, the cross with the curved extremities, going clockwise in Hinduism indicating prosperity, going counterclockwise indicating adversity. But in recent times, it's become the most infamous sign because of its appropriation by the Nazis, as we know. And nobody's going to say, well, come on, it's just a symbol. It's just a sign. No, get over it. No, if you put that symbol on your car or on your clothes in Germany, you'll be arrested, because that symbol it carries much more than just an indication. It's not just denoting something. It's connoting something much more, in this case, very wicked. So in the latter two definitions, iconic and connotational, the symbol is a key concept of aesthetics and cultural studies. Then he goes on, some of the other things he says I don't even necessarily agree with, but I like the idea of the connotation. That, and here I come back to the opening comments about what we presuppose, or what is related when you relate. We talk about what a relation is, different kinds of relation, categorical relation, transcendental ontological relations, supersubjective relations, intersubjective relations. But one thing that irritates me a bit in Dealey's writing is he's very poor on examples. He talks very abstractly, and then I want a dozen examples because this is so important. Show me where it works. Doesn't mean they don't exist. I just don't think that was maybe his strong point. Because when you get into the examples, what you are relating or what is being signified, that's what the terminus is, that fundament to that interpretant, then all these questions, these metaphysical, anthropological, cosmological questions come up, and theological questions come up. How are things represented? And the connotation, I think, is helpful. So I would, what do I think a symbol is? You'd have to. I suppose my best answer at this point would be it's very mysterious, and because you cannot get out of talking about the metaphysical background and the theological background of what is being related or what is being signified, for me it's still very much a question in evolution. I don't think the simple identification of it with conventional sign is wholly satisfactory. It's a bit as I feel about the distinction between a conventional sign and a stipulative sign. Conventional and stipulative seems to me to be simply a subdivision of arbitrary sign, a sign which comes from the human will. When you're still aware of the person that is saying, we're going to say this from now on, this means stop, this is a stop sign, everybody, you hear me? They're stipulating. But then years go by, and everybody says, well, that's obviously that's a stop sign. It becomes conventional. This convention and stipulation don't seem to me to be that's not an important distinction of sign in general, but a subdivision of conventional. But the symbol, in the sense in which people like Mircea Eliade, Carl Jung, also the perennialists with all of they go on and on and on about symbolism, René Guénon and company, they're onto something. It's not just, you can't cover it just with conventional signs. You'd have to ask, for example, at least, why did this convention arise? Why was this stipulation made? Stop sign, you could say, okay, it could have been circular, it could have been an octagon, it could have been a hexagon instead of an octagon. Arbitrary in the sense of could be this, could be that. But why is the heart taken as a symbol of love? Why is the cross become the symbol of Christianity? The crucifix is an image, but the cross is a symbol. And it speaks of things that you cannot easily put into words, that things that are connoted rather than being denoted. And so I would argue for symbol to occupy, as I more or less did in my article, a place of its own. I think it's the evoking of something that is almost impossible to put into words, or impossible to put into words, and yet which is can be very present, and can evoke mysteries that a simple conventional sign like the stop sign or a for the phoneme a, relatively simple, but are very. Why is it that when you see certain symbols, your blood runs cold? And why is it that, for example, I have here a book by Manly Hall, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. This guy he has symbols and 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 symbols, and they completely take possession of philosophy, theology, science, everything. This is where you really get to what's happening in the universe, and this is where the danger, or the how should I say, the desvio, the you get off the track, and you don't have this the rule of the image, and of the image of God in the Trinity, and man is the image of God, and Christ as the image incarnate, when you don't have that rule orienting your symbols, they go crazy. And you've got a world, a few years ago, the Rosicrucians came to me because I'm known as a specialist in world religions. And I asked them if they had a book of their symbols. And so they gave me this, which is like the other ones, just full of symbols. Just they're beautiful. I mean, they're interesting. And the point is, this will perhaps be my final point, allow you to ask questions. Oh dear. Is that the what was the point? The key. Yeah. Oh yeah. All of the symbolic emphasis, even exaggeration, is based on this fact that the universe is indeed the creation of God. Everything does have a symbolic meaning. So it's not that the Rosicrucians are wrong, or the perennialists are wrong, or the Hindus even are wrong. A great deal of respect for the Hindus, actually. What is a problem with truth is not falsehood, but it is the order of truth. Nothing is more important than this, than that it's better to have a falsehood than to have a disordered truth, because falsehoods are weak. They fall apart. It's like paper that doesn't stay. It's like like a book that I got from India. I got yesterday. After 4 months, I finally got the Encyclopedia of Philosophy by the Indian Society of Christian Philosophers. It arrived in the mail after 4 months because of the pandemic. I opened it up and it fell apart. The binding was horrible. I have a very good encarnadora who was going to take care of it, but it was bad. Anyway, that's what happens. That's what happens with falsehood. But an orphan truth, or a disordered truth, or a decontextualized truth still has the power of its truth. And so it's forceful. And that's the problem with the occult and with any kind of false religion. Isn't that it's false? It's that it's true, but a disordered truth. And the order, at least for Christians, is Christ. I mean, you can't get away from that. You can't put him to the side and say, yes, I also believe in that, but let's just philosophize now. No. That principle of order is absolutely fundamental. And I know you had some other questions which I haven't addressed. Why don't I allow you to comment or criticize or question?
Yeah, well, I think William has a couple. William, you want to go ahead with your questions?
Yeah, thank you. I really liked what Professor Scott said. Thank you very much. I have two questions. I think you already answered a little, but I want to hear you talk a little more. And it is related to Brazil, to my situation. So I want to know what Father Scott thinks about Mário Ferreira's notion of symbol. And I will already ask the second question because it is related, and I think it's good to ask now the second question also. Here in Brazil, I have already heard some Christians, even Catholic in Brazil, stressing this importance of a retrieval of natural symbolism. But at the same time, there is this possibility of raising symbolism to a dangerous place, as you already said. And I see here in Brazil, Catholic Christians even talking about astrology and temperament, so something that it's related to symbolism also. And I think it's a problem. So I want to know your thoughts about this situation. I think it's also related to the works of Mário Ferreira, that is now famous in Brazil.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a question which largely situates itself along the Platonic Aristotelian divide. I've always, since I began philosophizing many decades ago, I've never been able to separate Plato and Aristotle, although it becomes ever more important to distinguish between them. Once again, one thing the philosophers do is they bring up presuppositions, as I said at the beginning. Another thing they do is make distinctions that were not made before, which doesn't mean separating things. It means seeing the complexity within issues and substances and events and time and space and all that. So the Platonic has largely been identified in all of its forms, and the forms are legion, as more interested in allegory, symbolism, metaphor, symbol. That because they emphasize a hierarchical view of reality more explicitly, shall we say, than the Aristotelians also accept a hierarchy of reality. It's just not in the foreground, it's in the background. In the foreground, for the Platonists, is the true reality, to ontos on, is up there, and we are down here, and matter in particular is way down here, and the retrieval of our contact with that lost fullness of knowledge is achievable by using the instruments of the reflections of the higher realities and the lower realities, the symbols. A symbol becomes a means of redemption, a means of communion with what is superior. And there's obviously a large degree of truth in that, even from a Christian theological perspective. Think about the things that are above, not the things that are below, St. Paul says. You could put together a dozen quotations from Scripture that speak about the hierarchy. I'm publishing right now a book about angels, and that's obviously very hierarchical. So the Platonic, that's the Parmenidean, Pythagorean, Platonic, Neoplatonic current is very strong and never will disappear even from Christian theology. St. Bonaventure is still very much in that current, and he was a contemporary of St. Thomas, a friend of St. Thomas. And when Dante saw Thomas and Bonaventure in paradise, he saw each of them passing their eternity singing the praises of the other man's position. That is the humility. That was a poetic vision, of course, but it contains a very clear indication that these complementary views need to be complementary indeed. Just like we have two halves, two hemispheres of the brain. Just a few days ago, we celebrated the feast of the solemnity of St. Peter and Paul. I remember I preached, as I usually do, about the fact that Paul, there's a feast day for the conversion of St. Paul, but St. Paul as such and St. Peter as such don't have their separate feast days. The church has put them together because these two guys had a hard time getting along, and they represent what seem to be opposite views of the church, more conservative, fundamental view of St. Peter, and St. Paul is constantly asking questions and exploring and getting himself even in trouble. They're together. So I see Plato and Aristotle also that way. That they need to be kept together. And Mario Ferreira dos Santos, I don't know much about Mario Ferreira dos Santos. I have here his book on, what do you call it, Symbolica, Trattado de Symbolica. And I like what I read, just for the first few chapters where he defines symbols. And I have to say he represents what I would regard, and I think Nert in his idea of the connotational sign would also regard as a very interesting contribution. Somebody needs to study this guy more. I understand that Mario de Ferreira dos Santos, his works are very difficult to organize because his wife typed them up and she didn't type them up very well, and there's a lot of confusion. So we need to have somebody to do for him what people like what the guy's name, Fish and all these people that were doing the same thing with Peirce. They're putting out better editions, more and understanding better. I think Mario de Ferreira, he deserves that. particularly Brazil doesn't have a huge backlog of great philosophers. He's definitely one of them. And so on this issue, I would say I'm on the same page with him. And maybe you, William, as a Brazilian, could dedicate more time to him and help us all to integrate his contribution. What was your second question was about?
Yeah, this stressing of retrieval of natural symbolism and the dangers.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. There. I would have something to say. There's a tendency among some of the, it's certainly among the perennialists, very, very strong tendency of being very suspicious of modern science, and seeing the medieval view of the universe, of the cosmos, more in symbolic nature rather than in a interventionist nature. That once we eliminated final and formal causality largely in the 17th century with Galileo and Bacon and Descartes and Pascal and all the rest of them, that we turned the universe into this tapioca pudding that we can do whatever we want with. As our will becomes the means, we don't understand the essences of the things, but we're imposing our own needs and desires and producing an industrialized society, polluting the oceans and all that bad stuff. Absolutely true. But the science is being abused. The science is being abused in those cases that they cite. And you can only abuse a bad thing. You can only abuse a good thing. And the advances of science, I mean, anybody who gets sick, who gets ill today, or needs medical attention, they want the very last results of medical science most of the time. Even people that speak against modern science, when they really get sick, they're going to go to the hospital, and they want all the machines hooked up and all the latest drugs available. I think it's very important from the Christian point of view, to understand that the development of modern science, with all of its excesses and abuses, which are undeniable, is difficult to imagine without the background theology of the Middle Ages, that the world is created. It isn't a part of God. It isn't the other side of God, which was the tendency before and outside of Christendom, that the universe and God are indistinguishable, or just dimensions of one another, such that any kind of intervention, experiments, using the world, etc., developing technology, is seen as a kind of violation of a sanctuary. And once the Christian idea of creation became well based in the human imagination in time of the great scholastics, and it became clear, no, the world is not only not a part of God, it's distinct from God, perfectly distinct from God. It is non-divine, but it is made through the Logos. Everything was made through him, and nothing was made without him. So everything in this world bespeaks the mystery of God and invites investigation, invites pesquisa, invites science. The developments of modern science, they never developed in India, they never developed in China, they never developed in Egypt, because they didn't have that clarity, the conceptual clarity about, first, the non-divinity of the world, and secondly, the significance of the world. Now we're back to semiotics again, that everything in the world is significant. And the laws that we discover, the regularities, the measures that we make, reveal, as Einstein said, the most miraculous thing about the universe is that it is intelligible. You can imagine a universe that was chaotic. You couldn't understand anything. All you can do is appeal to the gods to save you from the next catastrophe. Well, we discovered the world is, largely speaking, very coherent, and it invites science. And our science is a part of the Christian attitude. That's why one of the things that distanced me from the perennialists. I have all the perennialist books here. I've read just about all of them, but I realize they have a trouble there, And the trouble is because the Christian message is not allowed to become a norm. It's one of many religions, and they understand it to be. If a perennialist happens to be a Christian, he will say, "I'm in the Christian form," or "I'm in the Islamic form." That is, it's the perennialism that Guénon and Schwann have formulated that I assent to, but it takes on this particular dressing or this particular dialectical formulation, which is best for my history, for my language, for my country. So I became a Christian, although almost all of them that do become either Orthodox or sedevacantist, which is the most radical of the extreme conservative Catholic. Sedevacantist is there's no valid pope. They don't like John Paul II. They don't like Benedict. They don't like Paul. They don't like John 23rd. They usually put the boundary up, the stop sign at Pius XII. And part of that is the idea that this old, this other view of the universe symbolically is the only one that is valid. And I would say it is also true and important. And the fact that we lost that in the Renaissance and the new science, we lost this understanding, especially of the stars. The stars. That's why I wrote this article about sonoscopy and idioscopy. Because I think that once you doubt the stars, once you say, oh, the stars, oh yeah, they're just a bunch of thermonuclear reactions. They're all going to die. They're not eternal. They're not constant. Yeah, they're kind of beautiful, sure, but once you get into that mindset, you've lost something fundamental, and that's where these people, these Christians you mentioned, they're right. We need to recapture that. There's no conflict between them. There's no conflict between sonoscopy and idioscopy. They should fertilize each other, and some things need to be corrected. You know, we do say some things in the past in past science that needed to be adjusted and corrected. That's the way life is. We don't have here Peirce is fallibilism. We don't have this absolute certitude about absolutely everything. We're always correcting and adjusting, and our paradigms are shifting. And many of our extreme conservatives, they're quite neurotic about gradating truth. The things we're absolutely certain, very certain about, maybe mathematically, but once you get into the world of physics, even today the scientists are no longer saying these are the laws of physics, but they're the statistical probabilities that most of the time work. So there's a so yes, William, I think I sympathize with the symbolism of the Middle Ages. I have a whole shelf of books about this. It's beautiful, and we need to bring the science, modern science, and this perennial view together. They're not opposed to each other. Wolfgang Smith, for example, I disagree with him on a few things too, but he's a very important scientist, mathematician, and he also accepts this more traditional view of the hierarchy of what he calls vertical causality. So it's possible to do that, but at the same time, we're also dealing with sin, with evil, with confusion, and great forces that are trying to keep especially the Christian message from surviving. So, yeah, does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah. Thank you. I think Jing can ask.
Okay. Yeah, just real quick, when you're talking about the stars, I was going to mention that one of our fellow members here, Dr. Michelle Codd, who's giving a colloquium this couple days here, he and I were going through the work Aristotle, De Cello, or De Cello et Mundo, as they sometimes called it, and I remember saying to him early on, I said, I don't think I'll ever be able to just understand what's being said here unless I can just get out to a desert somewhere and just look up at the stars and see, because we don't have that opportunity much. Even me as a truck driver, I rarely do, but I did one day get the opportunity to kind of see that in the the desert. And it's pretty. You're definitely right there. We could probably talk about that for a whole episode too, but I think I'm going to follow William's lead here and ask or maybe squeeze some questions together. I know we're going a little bit late on time. I mean, by all means, keep going because this is great. And if I need to, I can separate I can split it into 2 episodes, no problem. But I wanted to ask, and I think you've already kind of answered this, so this is why I'm kind of squeezing it in here. But about Peirce's definitions, I know you mentioned that. So you don't have to answer that again. I think you've already kind of answered that. But if there is anything else you want to add as far as distinguishing Peirce's, I don't know if I want to say the poverty of his. I don't know if I want to use that term, but it seems like his definition seems to be missing something. And as I understand it, he, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think his views evolved perhaps, and eventually he retracted some of the things he had initially said about. I'll let you correct me on that.
I really don't.
Oh, go ahead.
I don't know much about Peirce except what I've read in the last couple of years, and yes, he obviously he did. The one thing he didn't seem to change on at all are the 3 categories. I've read some Peircean scholars who say that he was clear on that all the way through, but I noticed that even the Peirceans that love him so much, they tend to, some of them at least. Again, I'm not qualified to make the statement probably, but my impression is that they tend to kind of sideline this triadic side of Peirce. He's preoccupied with 3 this and 3 that, and then all these. If you ever saw a blackboard full of all the different signs that he develops, each of them has there's Swati sign and DC sign, and they go on and on. Again, it's fascinating if you're smart, and this is where I draw the threshold of idiosyncratic, that he is also a scientist in the modern sense. This is something that probably would alienate him from some of our perennialist friends, is that he's very much a scientist, and his contributions to science, to geodesy, the measuring of the earth and such, are considerable. So some of what he does, I see it like some of the modern mathematical logicians. I find what they do fascinating, but I don't really think it's philosophical anymore. They've moved over into mathematics and to methodology. And God bless them. But the great conversation is what I think we really need to defend today. And Peirce, his contribution to that, I think, is important, but it's probably partial in regard to his whole productivity. I think he has a lot more to offer to mathematics, to science, to philosophy of science, maybe, and certainly to some dimensions of semiotics. But but all of that is subject to discussion and criticism, because I don't know that much about. He's definitely a giant. As Dealey puts him up there with Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas. So I'm not sure I would totally agree with that, but it certainly is significant that someone as brilliant as Dealey would make that suggestion.
Yeah, certainly. Okay. I guess my other question, this is maybe more of a request than a question. In your essay, Seven Signia, which is available on 3wisdoms.com for anyone who wants to read it, and I would recommend anyone to do that. It's available in English and in Portuguese. Anyway,
the Portuguese is quite an extensive revision. I need to. The English is okay, but it's in need of expansion, especially about symbolism.
Okay, so the English was first one, and then you converted it to okay. Yeah, I think I did read that, but I did what I wanted to ask you if you could share the snippet. I really liked your. I'm not asking you to read it, just retell. the illustrative example of the flag as a symbol, because here we have, I thought it was a really good example that you have the two kind of ways of looking at symbol being illustrated under one symbol. So could you talk, maybe talk us through that?
Yeah, it's somewhat like in the three categories of Peirce. You're listening to him to distinguish between the three so clearly, and then he comes out and says, but they're always simultaneous. They're always together, and which makes it even more interesting. And the thing about these signs is, I would say the same thing, that very often you can't have a conventional sign that isn't in some sense an iconic sign too. And with time, the conventional iconic sign will take on symbolic meaning, have this connotation beyond it. You wonder, for example, how did we start identifying this with yes, okay, affirmative, I'm all right. Even thank you here in Brazil, you can say thank you this way. You don't need to open your mouth. I do that when I visit the States, and people look puzzled because it doesn't. They know the thumbs up. Thumbs up is okay, great. But if said they do something for me, instead of saying thank you very much, just go. It's almost. But how different it would be if it had been your middle finger that had been extended. You could say, well, this is just a digit. I mean, everybody has them. It has tissues and bones, and just like the others. I'm just extending it. What's the big deal? And you can get in a serious fight extending your middle finger to the wrong person. And so there's something there that is something that began. There's a natural symbol. Is that a natural symbol for offense? Or well, actually, it is, because it's supposed to represent the phallus. I mean, you're saying to the person, pardon the expression, up yours in English. It's very nasty expression. But all you need to do is extend the finger, and it's all out there, and you're in big trouble. So this is the natural things become signs, ultimately because everything is significant. Okay, once again, the creation, everything is significant. So everything's up for potential signification. But once it becomes, if it's a natural sign like smoke or cloud, a cloud is a sign that there's moisture in the air. Well, somebody else said, no, it's not a sign at all. It is moisture in the air. You're seeing moisture in the air. Oh, okay. But it's a sign of coming rain. Oh, okay. But the other day I saw a cloud and there was no rain afterwards. Oh, okay. Well, so once again, what it is you're signifying, the whole of philosophy and science is always a background. The idea of sign is a very functional. And it's still one of the basic, not a primitive concept, but an almost primitive concept, because you can't get anywhere without it. So what I'm trying to say is that these different signs are often simultaneous, but you can distinguish their functions. Even in the let's take a miracle, Christ walking on the water. Let's accept that as a bona fide miracle. Well, he's walking on water. What is water? Well, water is just liquid. Usually, when liquid doesn't support bodies, you sink. You need to know that. And he was a man, so he had a body that had weight. So that doesn't make sense. Therefore, it's something. So it ends up being a natural phenomenon, juxtaposition of a male body and a body of liquid water, and then it begins to signify something. You said that doesn't ordinarily happen, so this signifies that something extraordinary has happened. All right, what has happened? Well, he's walking on water. Oh, what is walking? Walking is doing this. So you're always making these references to other things, and for it to be a miracle, it already needs to be a perception, and to be a miraculous perception, it has to be on the basis of laws or regularities already known previously, background. So there you have a natural phenomenon and a natural sign and a natural a miraculous signification. So it seems to me that the list that I made, which has seven signa, if you look at them closely, you take out the two supernatural ones, the sacrament and the miracle. You have Perseus signs here in the center. These three, as you have the indexical sign, which is very close to the natural sign, the iconic sign, which is the image, and the what he calls the symbol, which is actually the conventional. And what he doesn't have is the formal sign of the concept and the evocative sign of the symbol. And so, in a certain sense, my little categorization includes his in the middle, but contextualizes them with the symbol, the connotative, evocative symbol, and the most basic symbol of all, or sign of all, which is the concept, and then there are these two supernatural signs that only come into a religious context. So yeah. Anyway, as I say, I thought some of that through much better in the second version. There probably will be a third version too. But maybe if I write it again and if I translate it into English, I can do some more. That's what Dealey did. Dealey kept rewriting these things, but when he rewrote them, he didn't just translate it; he rewrote it. You know, you end up your writing is like that. It's a very salutary way of developing your thought.
Yeah, especially when you're going from one language to the other, you'll think about it in a different way, obviously. Something else might pop up or, stand out to you. Yeah. So, well, I think that answers pretty much the questions. I mean, I've got plenty more questions, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. So I will, William, do you have anything else you wanted to ask or throw in here before we wrap it up? Or?
No, I also have more questions, but I think we can close today.
Yeah, I do too. So we'll all have to wait. This is the meeting of minds, the meeting of thinkers of the past, present. The conversation it doesn't really have a conclusion. The things are just this or just that. We deepen our understanding, and new questions come, and the new questions make us understand the earlier questions in a different context. So that always happens. Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
I think it's
absolutely. Thank you.
I think it's a very, very important theme to be studied. Even in art, I studied art, and I saw in the environment of artists that they lost the notion of natural symbolism, and everything is only a construction of our mind. So there is there isn't this notion of natural symbolism, and I think it's very, very sad. And even in the cinema, in the movies, like I love the movies of Robert Bresson, and he was a Christian also, and he has a lot of natural symbolism in his movies. So I think this theme of natural symbolism is very important, and we lost today. Even the artist who works with symbols.
Yeah, one of the perennialists who I can only recommend is, and his books are somewhat free of some of the other perennialist preoccupations, is Titus Burckhardt on it's on art and symbolism or something. Titus Burckhardt. I've got the book here somewhere. I can't remember exact. Titus Burckhardt. He was a friend and also disciple of Fritz Schwann, but he had his own independent mind. He was a bit more academically disciplined, and I found his book to be remarkably good on natural symbolism. So as long as we don't lose our bearings on the image issue, there's plenty of natural symbolism to be rescued. Absolutely.
Well, Professor, this has been a great treat. I really, really appreciate you doing this for us. And once again, if anyone has any questions, they can feel free to just respond to the thread, and I'm sure you'll probably be able to see them. And we'll continue the conversation. And this has been just fantastic. So thank you so much for doing this.
Okay. Have a good day, and I haven't taken my walk yet, and the reason I tell everybody to walk is because everything is significant when you're walking. When you're running, it's just functions, just things just rush by. But when you walk, the sky, the birds, the trees, the grass, your own body, everything begins to speak. So I'm looking forward to that. Okay,
sounds
so
very peripatetic of you. All right, we'll see you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bless.